We're live? Great. Well, I've got a dog barking just to make it live. So we really are live, people, but welcome to this masterclass about why menopause could be the best thing that ever happened to you and why it could be the best life stage. And I'm delighted to be here, and thank you to Helenique for this opportunity that she's given me. So for those of you that haven't met me, I'm Clarissa Kristjanssen, and I'm a menopause mentor and coach, and I'm really passionate that women can have a much more positive menopause experience. Quite simply, we're in a world where we don't talk about menopause in that way, and I'm going to share some slides. Can we all see them? They're coming up nicely here. And I wanted to really talk about that and why so often menopause is portrayed, well, a little bit like this. We see or hear that word and we're flooded with images that talk to us about negativity, that dial up just talking about symptoms, that make us feel maybe anxious, concerned, and alone. You know, when I say the word to women that I talk to all over the world, what do they say to me? They ask me questions like, is that normal? What should I expect? Or if they're going through menopause, they say things to me like, is this never going to be over? You know, how many years do I have to go through this? And we perpetuate a negative perspective. And certainly even in countries where menopause is more talked about, we say a lot of things about how bad the journey was, how horrendous it was, and it gets fueled by a celebrity culture that's also saying that. And when we really look at the facts, what do we know? Well, we know that 20% of women barely know they've been through menopause. Seems incredulous. They sometimes rock up at their doctors, as I was having in conversation myself with a really great obstetrician doctor, Donna Ivor, and she said they come into my surgery and they're sort of 63 and say, do you think I've been through menopause yet? And we go, yes, I think you possibly have been through menopause now. And they didn't really realize it because they had minor symptoms. There are 20% of women who have an incredibly difficult time. And they can also have that with respect to the fact that they have a serious medical history. And then there's 60 to 80% of us who experience something. But the extent of the severity is hard to know. But I don't want to be Pollyanna about this either. And I always say that when I talk about menopause, I don't want you to think that I don't acknowledge that we have difficult times. And I'll share a little because that's been my own story. I went through menopause at about, 44, 45. And initially, I noticed I didn't sleep too well. I put on some weight. And then there were periods when nothing happened very much. I then had a time in my life where I had extremely heavy bleeding or flooding. And I kind of didn't know. I dismissed it, walked away until I suffered anxiety. And I had a panic attack in my office. So I'm very familiar that it's not a Pollyanna story, and it was very frightening. But through that process, I also had very little support from my doctor or my physicians. I was told that, you know, this was just a fact of life. Menopause was never mentioned. And I actually had one doctor who told me the reason I'd put on weight was that I ate chocolate in the supermarket queue while I waited at the checkout. And if you actually think about that, that's quite a shocking thing to say to a woman, to dismiss us in that way. But at the same time, she didn't offer any solutions. And so when we talk about why it could be your best life stage, it isn't to be, it's all wonderful and we're happy clappy. It's to recognize, to acknowledge that we can have a difficult time. But through that journey, we can also come out the other side with some tremendous opportunities to change the trajectory of our lives. And if you just think for a moment, we are going to live on the other side as postmenopausal women for maybe a third or even half of our lives. Increasingly, women are going into the change, the hormone imbalances and the declines in their early to mid 40s. For many of us, we can live to be 80 or 90. So we may live half our life as a postmenopausal woman. And therefore, it feels to me very much to say this could be a life stage where we could really reflect, change, and move our life forward. And that's why it's not about a Pollyanna story, but about one of opportunity for growth and change. But let's think about us. We live as women with cycles. Our whole life is about cycles and flux and change, whether that's puberty, pregnancy, menopause, and our monthly cycles. And I love to use this kind of an approach for us to think about women's life cycles. Spring, that's when we go into puberty. That's when we are young women. Our eyes have new, fresh and bright. We have new ideas, new experiments, and we're sort of starting out there in the world. And then we move into summer. And summer's often where I think a lot of society likes us to be, in this liberated superwoman, full of action, very sexy, full of expression type of space. And this is the woman that gets projected in social media and projected in the workplace. This is what we want to be, and this is what many women aspire to be. It's why we've got treatments going on. It's why we're juggling 5,000 balls in the air. And somebody says to me, "How are you?" And we answer, "Fine, and I'm so busy." And then perimenopause happens. And I think that's often where the conflict for us as women are as well. That in perimenopause, the hormonal shifts in themselves make us start to question. It starts to slow us down. We become a little bit more discerning. We feel we need to have some barriers. And then we start to move into this winter of our time, a time when we need to accept the changes. We often feel like, I'd like to do more, but maybe I don't even have the energy to do more. And I need to surrender and go into that transition phase where I'm just being, and then to be ready to emerge into the second spring. And a lot of the reasons I believe that we have conflict and difficulty in menopause is because the world is pulling us, and our own inner voices are pulling us to be summer, but our bodies are in, and actually our mind too is in winter and autumn. So this is conflict. And for me, it means that menopause is really about separation, surrender, and emergence. And if we can learn to do those things, that's when it can become your best life stage. So I'm going to share a little bit here about some of the ingredients we need to make autumn and winter really a positive time. And then I'm going to go into much greater depth around how we can do some of that. And I hope that you will be open to doing some practices. If we think for a moment about autumn and winter as seasons, they're times when nature is quiet and reflective. It's like we let go and plants go under the ground and they sort of just quiet. Earth can feel quiet. And if you're like me and you live in a northern hemisphere, even birds don't sing very much in the winter. And you notice the difference now the spring is coming. For us, there is the opportunity, if we embrace autumn and winter, to create more space in our lives, to let go of the busyness, to be quiet, to be reflective. Often we find it really hard to do that as women. We're so busy. As I said, busy is the word, the adjective we use to describe this time of our lives. I'm busy, I'm so busy. And I wonder if those of you who have been thinking of meditation, or if I was even to speak to an audience of women, as I did a while back, and I said, what about embracing meditation? What did those women answer me? Oh, I'm too busy. We don't have time for reflection, but that's exactly what the menopause is asking us to do. It's a time for rest. I love a quote recently that came for International Women's Day, and it should have been International Women Lie Down Day. That's actually, and we don't do that because we're so busy rushing and not resting. It's a time for accepting how we feel, and I'm going to talk more about our emotions, about being kind and compassionate to ourselves, and importantly, learning to listen to our amazing body, but actually tuning in to our hormones. Of course, autumn is a time of letting go. And as I said, menopause is sometimes a letting go of roles that don't serve us. And it is an important part of delegating and asking for help. Right now, we're going through a pandemic. And if we listen to women's voices, if we see the results from surveys that are coming, women are exhausted. And I think midlife women in the whole are holding up the world and their arms are getting very tired. And some of that is about the fact that we take on so much, that we're not delegating and we're not asking for help. But if we want perimenopause and menopause to be productive and positive, these are some of the things that we need to learn to do. One of the ways that I help us to, as women, to understand this is to break this down into something I call the 5 R's of recognizing. And what does that mean? To recognize where you are, to reflect. And how do we reflect? To reconnect with our own bodies and to learn to listen to them, to build better relationships, and to think about our repurpose, maybe to bring back a purpose that we had before life got busy and others became part of our space, or to actually find a purpose. Maybe we haven't had one that's been very clear before. So in this masterclass, what I want to share to you is the 5 R's, and I hope that you'll be willing to join me in some positive practices to help us get a sense of what each of these 5 R's could be like. So let's begin with recognizing. Menopause is a time of a lot of emotional change. We can't deny that. Some of that is physiological. Some of that is actually the impact that our hormones have on our bodies and our brain. And many women will talk about feeling tearful for no reason, suddenly going into the bathroom at work and bursting into tears, and they don't understand why. Or waking up feeling incredibly anxious about their children, and there may be nothing to be anxious about that they can pinpoint. Or we've carried lots of irritability And one of my clients described the way she felt was like a red mist would descend. But they feel this irritability and we carry it with us all day. And then we get home and we, well, unleash it on our loved ones. And I can personally say that I have done that to my son quite a few times, which when I went through the hormonal changes, I would come home and I would sort of scream at him from the smallest thing that he'd done, like particularly things like leaving the dishwashing undone in the sink. And suddenly you sort of take yourself aback and think, gosh, what have I done? And they're going, she's some two-headed monster. She's not my mother. In those times, recognize is really important. We have to recognize how we feel, these emotions that are coming through to us, to be able also to know that sometimes it's okay not to be okay, to feel these moments of grief, these moments of anxiety, of irritability, and to pause and let ourselves feel that emotion. One of the practices that I really love comes from Dr. Kristin Neff. She's an amazing, compassionate researcher. She works with different ways that we can learn, psychological ways that we can learn to be more compassionate and to meet different emotions and experiences in new ways. And one of her favorite exercises, and one that I've always used, is just to put our hands on our heart. And for a moment, just allow ourselves to feel the emotions that we're going through, to acknowledge that maybe today is not going okay for me, that I'm feeling whatever I'm feeling, and to breathe into that and to allow that. Maybe even to say that we can forgive ourselves if we've unleashed our temper on somebody. And in meeting that emotion, we can learn in ways to let go of it. One of the most foundational books that I worked with during this time is called The Journey to Mindful Self-Compassion by Dr. Christopher Germer. And it was such a wonderful book filled with practices that were very simple to do, but allowed you all the time with compassion and with kindness to meet your emotions. And when we do that, we don't get into that mode of beating ourselves up that's very easy at any time, but particularly I think menopausal women often are overwhelmed by the way they've responded to the way they feel, and it begins a cycle of I'm not good enough, or that I am not a good person or a good mother or a good partner. And we often have those, and by allowing ourselves to recognize the way we feel, we can change that. And that for me is often the first step. Sometimes meditative practices like Christine puts forward work. Sometimes you might be somebody who likes to journal and create that space in your life. But being able to do this is a huge part of being able to come to terms with the strong emotions and the changes that you're going through. My second R is always about reflecting and giving ourselves that space and that time that autumn, and particularly that winter aspect of the menopause, needs. But it isn't that easy for us as women to slow down. I was quite amused by this little picture of when we try to meditate. This is often what runs through our heads when we try to stop. When we try to have some reflective time, our heads are completely full of noise. And one of the ways that I feel, as being not only a neuroscientist, but also a mindfulness practitioner, is how important mindfulness can be for us at this time, to help us be able to pause, to reflect, and to come into a space where we can accept and acknowledge where we are.
Clarissa, just to come in and say we're not seeing the slides. Maybe you can try and reshare.
Can I try and reshare? Yes, of course. Let me end the slideshow. Is it not showing up?
No, not at all. I've put some messages on the box.
Ooh, let me try again and see. Well, I wonder why it's not doing that.
Might just have to reboot the share option, because sometimes if you move screens to check something and come back, it disengages it.
Has it come back now?
Now we've got it on. Excellent. Just give me a second. Okay. Do you want to start again from this slide?
I will. I'll come back from the reflect slide. How about that?
Beautiful.
Does that work for us? Yes. So a lot about reflecting at this time, I think, is connected to recognizing emotions, but to also having that space and that time, that stillness that is in the winter. Maybe I'll just go quickly to the winter slide and just say here, where we have time to surrender and be. I think that is often a time we can do. Does it work if I still do this? Do you still see the slides? You can. Great, thank you. That we are able at this time to stop. Our heads are like this, like she is in the image, just full. And being able to stop and to pause is very important. But we do find it hard. We are in this space where there's just so much noise in our heads. But for me personally, and I know for many women, and there's a lot of documented evidence of how really important mindfulness can be and what a critical tool it can be if we can reflect and be quiet. Mindfulness for me is a key aspect of the menopause. We can use it to clear our busy minds, to create space, to be quiet, to have a calmness, and to connect into ourselves. And I would highly be suggesting to women who are watching this to find and see if you can start a mindfulness practice. It doesn't need to be hard. You could start with an app, like a Headspace app, but have some time where you made 10 minutes, 5 minutes, 1 minute even, somebody said to me, 1 minute of pausing and breathing, reflecting and creating space for yourself would be so important. I really like doing mindfulness practices that are about using sound, because we can't control sound, and we spend a lot of time as women trying to control. And menopause is a time of surrender. It's a time of letting go of where you are, have been, and going into a kind of a no man's land where you've been a fertile woman. You're not on the other side. You're going through huge change and you're in this no man's land. And I think mindfulness helps us to do that. And mindfulness practices that use sound are really good because they teach us that we can't control lots of things, and we actually can't control that much of our hormonal journey naturally. If we choose to intervene with hormonal therapies, we can do that, but lots of women don't. And that's where I use practices like this listening to sounds, where you just don't try to label sounds, you listen to them. They come in and out of your consciousness. You let them come just how they are, and you're there in the moment, just being there. And that gives us a bit of space, some reflective space and time. And making that every single day is a lot of difference to the way we feel. It's making us calmer. And one of the things about that also is that cortisol and being stressed, and cortisol being the main stress hormone, plays havoc with your menopausal hormones, because we're already having a massive decline of progesterone. And that's the first hormonal balance we have, and then estrogen follows. Cortisol suppresses our levels of progesterone even more. which means that our hormonal balances are more acute and we feel symptoms even more than we might normally. A lot of the reasons that women have a lot of common symptoms is not just because we're having declining hormones, but also the imbalances that occur between estrogen and progesterone. Strangely enough, they call that estrogen dominance, even though estrogen is dropping. And so being able to enact reflective time and space is going to help us to manage our hormone level, our hormonal changes and the symptoms that arise out of those much more effectively. So reflect is my second R for seeing menopause as a positive life stage. One of the big components I feel of going through menopause easier, being able to navigate this transition, is to reconnect with our own bodies. And I often see that as being on a number of different levels. Many, many women throughout the world do not have a great connection with their own bodies, do not have a great awareness of how they feel, of what their responses are like on a day-to-day basis, maybe even don't have a relationship with what our bodies look like, what other women's bodies look like, what's normal, what's common and what's not. And building a relationship with our own body is really important for us to navigate menopause well. Being able to listen to small and subtle changes allows us to, well, control the things we can control. Many of the menopausal experiences we have are affected, as I said, by stress, but are also affected by what we eat, what we drink, how much exercise we take, whether we're able to rest and sleep. And being able to listen into the body and to make small corrections can have a massive impact in our experiences of menopause symptoms. And I'm going to use a hot flash, even though I know it's a bit cliche, as a lot of illustrative example here. Many of the reasons why we feel the intensity of a hot flash are often to do with the fact of what we've eaten or drunk. Spicy food, caffeine, and alcohol can all make something like a hot flash feel much, much more intense. So can stress. And we have a stressful situation, you might experience a hot flash for a number of reasons, but actually it can be intensified because of stress. So if we know and understand those things, we can put ourselves back in the driver's seat. We're suddenly back in control of our experiences. And lots of women will report that when they stopped drinking, particularly alcohol, and for me that was the same, drinking red wine, guess what? Their experiences of hot flashes, they were less intense, they were less frequent. So reconnecting in and learning to listen to our body is important. And one of the key things I would always say to women is to track their symptoms as well, to use an online tracker or to use a paper diary if one isn't available to you, and start to record what's going on with your body, what's happening, what's changing, when it's occurring,